Welcome to the Insight Stream, Science Meets Philosophy, where we explore the crossroads of reason and revelation, bridging the gap between timeless wisdom and contemporary thought. My name is Joshua Greene, and I'm honored to guide you through this thought-provoking series brought to you by the Bhaktivedanta Institute, located in Gainesville, Florida. This is episode 5, titled Pioneering a Global Bhakti Movement, the life and legacy of Śrī Bhaktivinoda. And today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Krishna Abhishek Ghosh, an award-winning professor and dean of faculty for Dharma Studies at Somaiya University in Mumbai, India. He also serves as director of the Institute for Vaishnava Studies in the USA and is a senior editor of the Journal of Vaishnava Studies. Dr. Ghosh holds a research master's degree in theology and religious studies from Oxford University and earned his PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. In today's conversation, we'll explore the visionary life and legacy of Śrī Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura, a spiritual pioneer whose work helped shape the global Bhakti movement and laid the intellectual and devotional foundation for modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Dr. Ghosh, Abhi, thank you so much for joining us. It's my pleasure, as always, to be spending some time with you. I think in the interest of full disclosure, guests need to know that we are old friends.
Yes,
This isn't our first rodeo, as they say. And what a great subject to be asked to talk about. This is terrific. You and I have been discussing Bhaktivinoda for years and years. And it's so exciting. He really does represent a turning point, doesn't he, in cultures? Maybe just to get us started, assuming that some viewers at least don't know about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, would you begin by introducing us to him and describing why his life and career are so relevant and vital to the world today?
sure, Josh. It's a absolute pleasure to be with you here today. I enjoy our conversations, and as I've said before, I wish this was like a season one, episode one of a long series of. We have so much to talk about. Um, I want to get to a very critical question that we face in our cultures today that cuts across, you call it east, west, the global north, global south, no matter how you frame culture. The key question that we are confronting, the generational challenges that we are looking at, is not just climate change, the Anthropocene, like it was, say, the Cold War, a couple of generations back, or the Second World War, but a pertinent, the pertinent theme that cuts across all of modernity and even a little bit of early modernity or pre-modernity is the question of consciousness. And it's around this question where we meet Bhaktivinoda and we see how seamlessly he connects the subjective and the objective worlds. He combines philosophy and poetry, and he also brings into question the ideas of empiricism, positivism, and the dilemma of whether we live in a mechanistic or a non-mechanistic universe in his works. And he sent his books to universities around the world and to key thinkers like um, Emerson, who's one of the thought leaders of 19th century America, presenting the teachings of Chaitanya, and in particular, um, focusing on what is known in Bengal as the Chaitanya Charita Amrita, which is a pun On the one hand, that title means the immortal biography of Chaitanya, but on the other hand, that title also means the nature of consciousness in immortality. And so that is his root text. And then based on that, he begins to engage with Western ideas. And he is somebody who was born in a Shakta family. That means a family of people who worshipped uh, the Divine Mother as the embodiment of the sum total of all energy, if you may put it that way. And then he went through a journey where he engaged deeply with Scottish Presbyterianism, with American Unitarianism. The Anglican Church was, of course, very prominent by the time he was active. He dabbled in Brahmoism, and then he discovered his soul in the texts of Vaishnava Bhakti. And so from the age, like he was probably my age when he first, began to seriously engage with these books. He was about 40. And then for the rest of his life, he wrote about 100 volumes, each volume anywhere between 300 to 500 pages. And only a fraction of that has been translated into English. His works have been translated. So here we have a pioneering thinker who bridges these various um, islands of culture, thought, and science. And he does it based on his archives of Vaishnava Bhakti. So I think that's what makes him very significant. He is a father of 14 children, a deputy magistrate in the British government during the Victorian era, and a mystic by night. And so that's what makes him so intriguing as well. So he's not just dealing with questions of politics and science, he's doing it as a mystic, and he's doing it with poetry. And even his prose reads like poetry. And so when I did my research graduate work at the University of Chicago, focused on Bhaktivinoda, and I began to ask, okay, how does this individual who has inspired most of the prominent, well-known thought leaders of our times, like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and the Tagores and Haraprasad Shastri, the Indian historian, and he himself is pretty relatively unknown. Well, how does he influence and engage with the notion of the West as we know it? And so that's, I think, a very good, quick intellectual biography of the person we are discussing today.
Yeah, that was well said, very succinct. You made some really crucial points there. First of all, that Bhaktivinoda did not approach the question of consciousness from a religious starting point. As you mentioned, he was a man of the law, an intellectual, um, more engaged by the works of the Unitarians than his own Hindu texts. And in that sense, someone we might be able to identify with, in that he never espoused Indian religion or Hinduism or anything like that. He was speaking as an intellectual, as a modernist. Tell me, since this is your graduate work, and I suspect you know more about Bhaktivinoda than almost anyone. Is there anything particular about his approach to the challenge of resurrecting this mission of Chaitanya, the 16th century pioneer of the Bhakti tradition? What is it that you've discovered about him and his approach to that you found surprising? Was there anything in particular that stuck out for you in the way he approached his mission?
Yes, and of course, there were many things that stuck out. The whole journey was like, walking through wonders every single day. And just to premise that question, Josh, I grew up in a family that had routinized the mysticism of Bhaktivinoda's tradition.
How do you mean routinized
And
the
I'll
mystics?
unpack that for you. The tradition has a core, few core components: the recitation of divine names, the worship of images, which Christian missionaries at that point called idol worship, and a system of meditation that focuses on singing, that focuses on exiting one's daily routine and entering Krishna's routine. And it's like a 24-hour lifestyle meditation, if I could put it that way. And so we were in that lifestyle, but I never really understood why. And it wasn't until I read through all of the works of Bhaktivinoda that I realized how broad he is in terms of his vision, and yet how deep his roots go when it comes to fidelity to tradition. And so what he was doing wasn't just his books, it wasn't even Sri Chaitanya's books. These were the teachings of Krishna that is, by indigenous historical methods, more than 5,000 years old and had been passed down from generation to generation through a disciplic succession. And once you understand the ambit of what this is, you realize that these are things that only Krishna could have known if the story is true.
All right. So
Right?
for those viewers who may not be familiar with the tradition, when you say Krishna, you're referring to the supreme being, God. Yeah.
That's a shorthand for describing Krishna, but Krishna is, I think, you know, not just God. Krishna is Bhagavan. And the word God is an English word that is rooted in the Judeo-Christian concept of referring to Jehovah, who is the supreme divine being in the Hebrew Bible and continues to kind of intervene in human history in the Greek Bible through Jesus Christ. When I talk about Krishna, it's a much more nuanced concept. Bhagavan means a character in whom you can experience the highest kind of perfection of six specific qualities: strength, wealth, fame, knowledge, beauty, and detachment. So, for God to be God, and I'm using the word God as a shorthand here, God cannot take himself seriously or herself seriously. God must play. And God is playing with nature, and we are nature. And we are suffering in this world because we think of ourselves as distinct from nature, distinct from the universe. So, if I may use a little bit of a new age language here, essentially, Prakriti means we are sparks of consciousness that is a part of nature through which the universe experiences itself. Right? This is at the root of bhakti. And what Krishna, often described in colonial missionary English as the supreme personality of Godhead, and by the way, that term was used first by the Unitarians, the personality of Godhead. Krishna is a character not to be worshipped of as God, not the dispenser of justice, but a sweet boy you fall in love with for no other reason than he is extremely sweet. And
I love what you're doing here. You're lifting the conversation and our exploration of Bhaktivinoda's mission out of the usual realms of Indian history, Hindu history, religious history, and you're giving it this kind of separate and distinct ontological reality of its own, which I think is critical. I mean, what if I may, just for a moment, kind of step outside the interviewer interviewee roles that we have here.
absolutely go for it.
What I love so much about conversations with you, Abhi, is that they're very open-ended, very candid, very personal, and they deal with issues that I think any thinking person today is concerned about. The destruction of the environment, the fact that warfare is growing, it's not shrinking, that hostilities are on the march. And there seems to be this acrimony among peoples. I mean, look, I'm a New Yorker. I grew up here, you know. I'm 75 now. I do not remember a time in my life when the hostilities and the bitterness that we're seeing acted out every day, the terrible cruelties that are being waged by one community against another community ever happened before in my recollection of 3/4 of a century of growing up in the United States. Something's missing. Something's been sacrificed here. And when you and I talk about Bhaktivinoda, which we do with such delight frequently, I can't tell you how much pleasure I derive from it. We talk about what a wonderful innovator he was, how he was able to point to the universal value of Krishna as a unifying force in the world, Chaitanya as the pioneer of a method for joining, of uniting with him, and how utterly non-sectarian all of that is, and how appealing to a thinking person. I mean, that's what gets me so excited about our talks. It's for everybody what Bhaktivinoda did.
You're absolutely right. In fact, there is a particular verse in the Bhagavad Gita which is very popular in India. And practically every kids or every at least millennial knows it because it used to come on Sunday morning TV show whenever they telecast the Mahabharata, which is, and I'll translate from the Sanskrit live, whenever and wherever there is a decline of dharma and a rise of adharma, I recreate myself to destroy the vicious and to protect the virtuous. I manifest myself again and again, era after era. And in his commentary to that particular verse, Bhaktivinoda Thakur points out, do not think that avatars are born only in India.
Hmm.
Right there, right there.
Yeah.
You know, the carpet for any kind of cultural chauvinism, nationalistic, egotism is the rug is pulled out of your
Yeah.
feet right there. And then he
Beautiful.
says there is dharma, which is righteousness, law, balance in every culture. And to the extent there is dharma in this world, dharma degenerates, is the nature of this world. And to reinstate dharma and to, kind of restore balance, avatars appear. And if you know anything from the Bhagavata, which is primarily Krishna's biography, it says that there are as many number of avatars as there are waves in an ocean. And then Bhaktivinoda points out that, but God does not give love for himself. That would be very narcissistic. A devotee of God is able to give love of God. And to the extent we see devotees of God appearing in various cultures, there is also that love of God. And in another place, he says that um, Moses, for example, in the Judaic tradition, is demonstrating a love of God which is very fraternal. Right? He argues with God. Who argues with God? So you see the fraternal love that is explained as um, Sakhya in Sanskrit, in the Bhakti tradition, Bhakti mystical traditions. And then he says that Jesus Christ thinks of God, that same God, as his Father. That is a parental love. Right? That is love of a son or a child towards the father or father towards the child. And in Sanskrit, it's called Vatsalya. And then if you look at the Prophet Muhammad of Islam, peace be upon him, he calls himself the Rasul, the chant of Islam is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, that there is no other no other ultimate divine but Allah, and Muhammad is his slave or is Allah's slave. And that in Sanskrit is called dasya, servitude. So in a time where for centuries dharmic traditions wouldn't want to directly engage with the Abrahamic religions that were coming on Indian soil, Bhaktivinoda Thakur creates this template by taking the theory of rasa, which is, you know, a theory of divine emotions, and engages that tradition with Islam, with Christianity, with Judaism. And then in another article, he says that, if there are a group of tribal hunters, they would probably experience that same God as the highest tribal hunter. So, in a sense, humans are made in the image of God, but our preference of how we want to experience God is made, by the limits of our consciousness. And that divine reciprocates with us because that's the best we could do, as long as we have sincerity and we have devotion. Right? So, to get back to your point, it is a very universal way of articulating bhakti in an age of science, medicine, and technology without compromising the poetry. And the last thing I want to mention in this point, that to answer this question, that a lot of people miss, and I have seen my scholar friends as well as my Vaishnava friends totally kind of skip, is that Indian culture, spirituality, and religion are based on epics. The Vedas are the earliest form of poetry, but they are practically irrelevant, not just to us, but also to a lot of poets who were even there during Krishna's time. And Krishna himself says the Vedas deal with material nature. The point is to transcend it, right? And so, what is really important is the Ramayana, which is the first epic, then the Mahabharata that comes after the Ramayana, the appendix to the Mahabharata, Harivamsha, the conclusion to the Mahabharata, which is the Bhagavad Purana, and a commentary on the Bhagavata with the example of the life of Chaitanya, which is the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So Bhaktivinoda is very deep in his exegesis, in his interpretation of these epics. And these epics formulate a form of spiritual practice that is at the root of bhakti mysticism. And so the very popular chant, which is, I would think of it as India's most popular spiritual export, the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, weaves together the heroes of these epics. Rama is the epic hero of the Ramayana. Krishna is the epic hero of the Mahabharata, Harivamsha, and the Bhagavad Purana. And Hare is their common identity, right? And so by meditating on these figures, you enter the root of the tradition. But at the same time, he articulates all of it in such a universal way that, wars, as you said, are timeless, as old as human history. But at any given point when we are facing a generational crisis, these epics formulate a spirituality and a worldview where we can go back to the roots of who we are and question our human nature and our role in this universe. And I really liked how one of my mentors at Chicago, Wendy Doniger, once put it. She said that these epics operate both as a telescope and a microscope. It is a telescope because we read these epics and we look out in the universe and we realize our insignificance. And we try and find our place in this universe that we can hardly fathom. And yet they are like a microscope because it zooms in to our human condition, to our soul, asks questions of who we are and why human nature often fails us. And thus they form a giant mirror in which we see ourselves both at a very close proximity and yet at the same time within the wide tapestry of this creation. And
Mm.
so Bhaktivinoda really leverages that in his poetry, in his liturgy, in his letters, in his journals, which I have never seen translated so far. So maybe that's one of the things I should do at some point. And I think his works speak for themselves. And as future generations begin to ponder the big questions, Bhaktivinoda provides deep answers, and that's why he's so significant in the tapestry, in the night sky of philosophers and scientists and thinkers of the world.
Thank you. That was beautiful. If you're just joining us, we're discussing today with Dr. Krishna Abhishek Ghosh about the career of 19th century um, uh, religious reformer, pioneer of the Bhakti movement, and author of more than 100 works on devotional theology and philosophy, Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura. Um, Abhi, I want to situate this a little bit for people who may not be familiar with the history here. Bhaktivinoda came along at a time when there wasn't much appreciation for India in the world. Um, it was viewed by the European British colonists and others as a rather backward place. As you said earlier, the temple worship of the forms of divinity was decried as idol worship. Um, there wasn't much of an attempt to actually understand the depth of the culture. It was simply seen as not very Christian. It's the other way to go. And if these people are ever going to earn a seat at the table of the modern world, they really have to get away from all of this Krishna worship and chanting of mantras and deities and all that sort of thing, and come up to the light of European Christianity. Um, can you describe a little bit for us about Bhaktivinoda's awakening? What was it that happened that gave him a renewed perspective on his moment in time?
Yes, that's a very broad question. And so I will try to kind of track back and spend a couple of minutes explaining European presence in India. Now, Indians generally have not gone out of India to explore, to discover, to colonize, except for maybe the Chola kingdom and, but not another major continent the way Europeans have. And so India had foreigners coming onto this land for however long we can imagine. We hear about Alexander, the Macedonian king. We hear about St. Thomas, one of the apostles of Christ, who came to India. But real European presence in India happened after the Dark Ages, the European Dark Ages. And that started with Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, um, identifying a sea route to India because all the luxury goods of that time, like spices and silk, came from India. And
So
so
we're
you
talking late 1400s, early 1500s here.
that's yes, the about late 1400s, late 1400s, 1480s to 1490s. And when the Portuguese came, they felt that India was so much like Europe. In fact, they said that, oh, these people in Portuguese have casta, which means they have their clergy, their nobility, their peasants, and their laborers, just like Europe. And the nobility and peasants don't dine at the same table. And when the Portuguese first came to Kozhikode, Calicut, they went to a Kali temple and they somehow felt that it was some form of a derivative of a temple to Mother Mary that Indians had designed for themselves. So they essentially thought that Indians were Christians except they needed to be reinstated to their original Christian forms. It was not till the Dutch, the French, and primarily the British came to India that the question of civilizing Indians came up. And even in the 1600s, that is 200 years after the first arrival of the Europeans in India, the British East India Company, the private company that ruled a subcontinent, were minting coins with the deities Sita, Ram, Lakshman on their back. And so they wanted favors from Indians. And it was not till about 1813, which is almost 200 years later, when the draining of Indian wealth had, very successfully been executed, that the question of whether missionaries should be allowed on British soil first came up, because the East India Company was broke, fighting wars and annexing land, and they were no longer interested in respecting and honoring local traditions and customs. And around that time, the city where Bhaktivinoda grew up, Calcutta, emerged as the capital of the British Empire. The first universities, like Oxford and Cambridge, or modeled after Oxford and Cambridge, was set up there. And India was, maybe, how do I even put it? Indians were told that their civilization needed to be reformed, not just from the inside, as the Brahmos were trying, but from the outside. So Indians couldn't experience redemption unless they accepted the white, blonde, blue-eyed Jesus of Europe. And Bhaktivinoda, in that context, came from a village to a city where the British were setting up the second capital of their empire. And the Bengali Bhadralok, which were a class of people that, in a way I belong to, and my ancestors did, and so did Bhaktivinoda, were the first group of people in Asia whose inner worlds were transformed by European knowledge systems.
So Bhadraloka
And
is the intellectual group, the intellectual community,
not just the
educated community.
intellectual community, these are the urban elite. They are educated, they are the nouveau riche, they're, the new money is flowing through them. They have opportunities, they have windows to the world that very few people in other parts of India have. So the Bhadralok are a privileged class of people who are able to be the tools of empire in keeping India the crest jewel of the British Empire.
And that was Bhaktivinoda's environment. That was his milieu growing up.
That was his cultural milieu. And most of the people who were Bhadraloks came from families in villages or other cities that were under the influence of the Mughal Empire, but now a new European culture was emerging. And so, for you to be civilized, it would be better if you had an English name, and you wore pants and pants and a suit. And so those became markers of civilization. Are you able to speak English? Are you reading American and British works? And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur came and engaged with this class of people. And one of my ancestors, who was also a Ghosh, Kashi Prasad Ghosh, a poet, was Bhaktivinoda's uncle, who educated him, who trained him in public speaking, writing, and engaging with the debates that were mainstream in the media of those days, right? And so that was overall the cultural context. Now we must be sensitive to the fact that not all periods during British rule of India looked as tyrannical to Indians as what happened after 1885. And that personally affected Bhaktivinoda. There was a law passed called the Ilbert Bill that allowed Indian judges and magistrates to preside over criminal cases where um, the plaintiff or the defendant could be a European person. And that basically, started a culture war. And the main argument that came up in the media of those times is that brown people do not have the moral fabric to be able to judge people who are white. And here Bhaktivinoda was a brown magistrate dealing with this kind of a crisis of the empire, right? And that's where he dove back into the spring well of his spiritual ideas. And he said that at the end of the day, the British and Bengalis are brothers put together in the same family by the will of destiny for whatever reason that we may never know. And instead of racing to the bottom and being vindictive towards each other, we must restrain ourselves. The British must understand that we are their elder siblings, civilizationally at a stage where we are more mature. But they have the power of technology and governance. And like in a joint family among Bengalis, where the elder brother often hands over some of the responsibilities of the family to their younger siblings and take on the role of spiritual advisors, we too should function like that in a world that is becoming smaller and smaller every day. And in 1896, about 11 years later, when the Swadeshi movement, the self-rule movement, began to kind of get firm ground in India, where the British policies were brutal and inhuman, and that led to a loss of lives. And Indians realized that these people are not here to provide us jobs and a good economy like they promised, but they are here to brutalize us. Bhaktivinoda Thakur did something very interesting. He did not join the anti-colonial protesters on the streets. He took an early retirement from the British government, and he went and took initiation in the traditional monastic kind of Babaji, what's known as the Babaji initiation, where one becomes a recluse meditator. And he practically walked around the streets of Calcutta half naked in his Babaji garb, collecting 1 rupee from every door to build a temple that he envisioned would be the highest pilgrimage of yoga where Westerners would come. And that temple is known as Yoga Pit, the pinnacle, the apex of all pilgrimages of yoga. And that was his way of responding to the cruelty of the British Empire. That instead of trying to be, trying to decolonize and change governments and being reactive, if we are spiritually grounded and we know who we are, then no storm can uproot us. And it is from that space of peace and confidence that Indians should respond to the crises that are facing the world today. And it also, kind of refers back to a mandate from Sri Chaitanya that Bharata Bhumite, and I'll recite little Bangla and I'll translate it for you. Bharata Bhumite Manushya Janmo Jar, Janmo Sarthak Kori Karo, Paro Upokar. Jare Dekho, Tare Koho, Krishna Upodesh, Amar Aggaye, Guru Hoya, Taro Ei Desh. So if you have the privilege, mind you, at that time and age, Indians thought it would be the worst thing to be born in such a God-forsaken country, right? But he says, even despite that, his point was, if you have the privilege of being born in India, then you have the sacred duty to share, to help others and uplift others, and be there to pull them out of their misery. Whoever you meet, said Chaitanya, and something Bhaktivinoda repeated. Whoever you meet, share the advice of Krishna. And in this way, deliver this message, becoming a teacher on my behalf. And
Yes,
so,
here's spiritual truth to colonial power.
yes, but for Bhaktivinoda, it wasn't about colonial powers. And like you mentioned, wars were always there. If you read Krishna's biography, which is the 10th book of the Bhagavata, it starts by saying that once the world was taken over by rogue kings who were armed to the teeth and were ready to fire weapons against each other, destroying life and destroying property at the slightest provocation. And this was the context in which Krishna was born. This is the context in which Sri Chaitanya was born. So we who were born after a moment of relative peace and quiet in the Western world post Second World War may not have the memory of war embedded in our consciousness. But like you pointed out, violence and war has always been a part of human history. And that happens because we are rooted in our egotism rather than knowledge of our divine purpose. And to educate people about our divine purpose, to tell them how and why we are a spark of consciousness in this big, wide universe, which we sometimes think as bleak and dark and vindictive, but in reality, we are here for our own inner growth, and we are going through all of these experiences as a journey of self-discovery. When we come to that point, then we would have less people engaging in this kind of violent wars or violent anything. And this is the message of Jesus Christ. This is the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Bhaktivinoda is a very significant messenger. I mean, I would think what Thomas Aquinas is to Christianity, who kind of organized Christian theology in Aristotelian terms for people who were the thought leaders that not only were there during his generation, but that came after. Bhaktivinoda did something very similar. He took the entire ambit of these epics and their commentaries and their roots, which are the Vedas, the philosophical books, and he created a systematic theology around it that was broad, that was deep, and that was a viable template for our postmodern condition.
Now, this is an important topic, I think, in the time we have left. I would love to spend a little bit of time on this with you. There was a major shift in the way the devotional culture, specifically Chaitanya's Sankirtan chanting mission, his movement, was presented by Bhaktivinoda. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about what was Bhaktivinoda's insight into the world that he was addressing? Because this is a different world now. This is a post-Enlightenment, European dominant, rationalistic, intellectual age. And here he is assuming responsibility for taking millennial teachings very, very long ago, right? Pre any of this modernity, and finding a way to convey the contemporary universal relevance of that wisdom. Could you describe a little bit about what was his thought process? How did he go about making that adjustment?
The one word that characterizes his thought process is the English word balance. He is a balanced thinker. I have read many, many intellectuals, and I have found out that very often they take themselves too seriously and get carried away. And here I found somebody so refreshing who understood, and he helped me understand what it is to be a human in this world and respond to situations with authenticity and
Mm.
intellectual rigor. Because,
Lovely.
sometimes we are authentic, but we are intellectually lazy,
Mhm.
you know.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. Um, and if you look at the ambit of the tradition, he represents Indian aesthetics in its transcendental interpretation, that was given by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, in a way that fits into the glove of contemporary European modernity. And I'll unpack that for you in a second. Indian philosophical traditions are rooted in answering just one simple question. That is, how do we become free from suffering? And many Western philosophers have said over the last 2.5 centuries that because Indian philosophers are preoccupied with this question, there is nothing called Indian philosophy. Because irrespective of suffering, philosophy should be the dispassionate pursuit of the truth. And the Indian version of it says, you cannot neglect your subjectivity, which is rooted in suffering, no matter what truth you pursue. And so there are two real branches of Indian philosophy that emerge out in the ancient world. One is called Astika. Astika literally means those who accept the validity of the Vedas, and Nastika, which is those who do not accept the validity of the Vedas. So
Vedas meaning the high spiritual texts of India.
Vedas are the first known set of poetry to practically all of humanity, next to the Sumerian cuneiform scripts. The Rig Veda is the oldest book of sacred poetry known to humanity. And they are the root inspiration of everything that came after. So those who did not like the Vedas could react against the Vedas, and the Vedas were liberal enough to accept that kind of criticism, right? So the Buddha was an Nastika, somebody who rejected the validity of the Vedas. Many of the Jain Tirthankars did not accept the validity of the Vedas. They were an ancient group of hedonists who are deep intellectuals as well, known as the Charvakas, who believed that, beg, steal, borrow, you must live today well because who knows what's coming tomorrow. And they did not accept the Vedas. The question of God is irrelevant in this whole discussion in Indian philosophy because even the six so-called traditional schools of Vedic philosophy, which is usually paired into two, and I know this is a little bit esoteric, but I'll still name the names. Mimamsa, which is a school of ritual, Vedanta, which is a school of philosophical conclusions, Nyaya, which is a school of logic, Vaisheshika, the school of particularism, like what we find in the Greek philosopher Thales, and then Sankhya, the school of categorical analysis, and Yoga, which is the school of intuitive practices that free us from suffering, right? In all these six schools, Vedanta has an understanding of Brahman, which is a kind of, at least apparently, an impersonal existence of a divine entity. Only yoga specifically articulates a supreme ruler, an ultimate ruler called Ishvara, which can roughly be translated into God. But in the colonial period, the word astika, which means I accept, or people who accept the validity of the Vedas, are translated as theists. And Nastikas, which are people who do not accept the validity of the Vedas, are translated as atheists. So, Indian philosophy gets hijacked by Christian theology. And in that context, Bhaktivinoda kind of draws us back to the roots. And this is the point we started with, Is Krishna God? Yes, because that's the highest concept that we can imagine in the English language in the Western world. But Krishna is not quite God. Krishna is much bigger than that. Krishna is Bhagavan. And that is why Prabhupada, who was a third generation successor of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who came to the West with his message, articulated the supreme personality of Godhead, taking the personality of Godhead from the Unitarians that Bhaktivinoda studied with, and adding the word supreme that his spiritual master, Bhaktivinoda's son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, presented as Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead, which is the ultimate persona of divinity, if you want to translate it into 2025 English, right? And so, to go back to the question, to kind of beginning to wrap up our conversation, we um, looked at the individual, Bhaktivinoda, we looked at the culture and institutions that made him, and now we are talking about what is the essence of his contribution and what characterizes his thought. And I would say balance, and that's where we started. Like, he balances science and philosophy. He balances poetry and prose. He balances politics with purpose. And I think that in his own imagination of himself, he saw that he was no more than a humble servant of Radha. And let me unpack that for you. I mentioned that the Hare Krishna Mahamantra is really the string, like you could literally call it the background score of the epics of India, right? And that becomes a object of meditation in what is known as Vaishnava Yoga in the Bhagavad Purana. And what Bhaktivinoda Thakur does is he keeps innovating these meditative techniques. And when we started, I mentioned a brief point that this school of meditation engages a practitioner where we exit the drama and routine of our lives, the grind as we call it, and enter the drama and routine of Krishna's life. And so it is a very engaging form of living where you're constantly thinking about Krishna and what would Krishna do. And if you look at the epics, Krishna would do whatever his dear beloved Radha would say. Right? And Radha is his, there are no English words that describe an Ishwari, the supreme goddess of his life. And Krishna went through, if you look at Krishna's life, it is a serial disaster. I might get into trouble for saying that, but he's born in jail. He grows up incognito, hidden with a set of foster parents. He gets identified as a threat to royal power when he is very young. He is literally ripped apart from all his friends, his village, and everything that ever mattered to him. He loses the love of his life that he keeps thinking about for the rest of his life. And the rest of his life is essentially fighting one corrupt king after another till he finds himself at the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And there is one particular verse in the very famous book called the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna spoke about what it means to uphold dharma. And in the second chapter, I think verse 70 or 72, Krishna makes a grammatical mistake. He uses the word Brahmani, which is feminine for reality, where in usual Sanskrit grammar it is described as Brahman, which is neutral or even masculine. And the school of interpretation that we know today as Gauriya Vaishnavism says that even in the middle of that battlefield, Krishna is thinking about Radha and he exposes himself. He's ready to take bullets for Arjuna, his best friend, because he believes in the purpose of Sri Radha. And in the Gauriya tradition, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu knew within that he was Radha. And Bhaktivinoda said that only when we are able to understand the depth of love in the character of Sri Radha, we are able to respond to the crises of this world from a space of compassion and forgiveness. And that is the level of consciousness we must gradually raise ourselves to through spiritual practices. So, spiritual practices have a telos, a particular goal, that is to raise human consciousness to its highest zenith. And that's, I think, Bhaktivinoda's key contribution to the world. And, that's what he invites us to examine and imbibe. And he predicted that in the future there would be a class of Saragrahis, or essence graspers, who would be able to transcend the boundaries of culture even while being embedded in their own culture and respond to the realities and the crises of the world. And he himself saw himself as a Saragrahi. He said that Hinduism is my culture, but Vaishnavism is my dharma. Right? And he points out to a Christian theologian from Germany called Johann Neumann and says in his article called Krishthoridoy Vaishnav Dharmi Rudoy, in the second volume of his journal Sajjantoshani, which literally translates the dawn of Vaishnavism in a Christian heart. That, this gentleman doesn't know anything about Vaishnavism. Yet, when you look at his works, you see that he is nothing but a Vaishnava. A Vaishnava is something who, and I'll move on from Bhaktivinoda and quickly refer to Gandhi here, who is known as the father of the modern Indian nation state. Vaishnavas, Janato, Tene kahiye je, Pida parai jani re, right, in Gujarati, which means a Vaishnava is one who can empathize with the suffering of others. Paradukhe upakara kare koi mana abhimana na ani re, that they extend themselves to alleviate others in their suffering when others are suffering, not to get any mileage out of it. They did not take any honor or pride in their service. And that is the depth of love that Sri Radha teaches, that Sri Krishna fights for, that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spreads, and that Bhaktivinoda brings to the West. And it eventually reaches us through, his followers and disciples and grand disciples, the foremost among whom is A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Right? And so, that's where we locate Bhaktivinoda. But I want to also quickly say that he is not just a pioneer of the worldwide Bhakti movement. He is a philosopher, a thinker, a polyglot, and quite a maverick, I would say a maverick mystic who, engaged people in all kinds of ways, not just within devotional communities, but also secular communities and in the government, and you name it, right? So it's a very broad visionary, and I'm glad we are able to see him in that light. I think, I do this mental exercise often. Then if Bhaktivinoda was present in this podcast today with you and me, what would he say? And based on the writings of Thakur, Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura that I've read, he would advise us just one simple thing: that we cultivate a sense of epistemic humility and meditate on grass as a great example of how to be humble. Grass gets trampled over, and right after that, it just straightens up, looks up at the sun, draws energy, and focuses on creating food for itself. So being humble as a blade of grass means not to get trampled over and yet not react to the miseries of the world we experience. To be as tolerant as a tree. Trees don't produce fruits to eat themselves. Trees always produces fruits for others. It gives shade to others. And to live a life that is purpose driven and in service is the second thing. Trinadapi sunichena, as they would say in Sanskrit, taroriva sahishnuna, amanina manadena. Most of the conflict in this world arises from our desire to lord it over, have respect without looking at core issues that leads to such egotism, right? And the final word is when we engage in the world with the sweetest love song on our lips, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. But then we find a way for science and spirituality to marry each other, at least in our lives. So that's what I think he would tell us if he were hearing and listening in and had a word to say in this conversation.
Well, thank you. That was a action-packed summary of the extraordinary career of one of modern history's great pioneers of devotion, Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura. You led us through an extraordinary life that did not begin with, he wasn't born as a religious missionary. This was someone born into European colonial modernity and who became a court magistrate and whose career looked like it was heading in a very different direction until he discovered the life and teachings of Chaitanya, at which point he became so inspired that he dedicated the rest of his life to preserving and perpetuating that movement around the world.
That is correct.
And you also gave us a really wonderful connecting link between, let's say, the life of the mind and the life of the heart. That the pursuit of knowledge, and you walked us through the many different schools of knowledge from India, only makes sense if they touch the heart and bring us out of our own somnolence and lack of inspiration. So I want to thank you for that. It's been wonderful, as always, hearing you describe the life and career of Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura.
Thank you, Josh. And if you allow me to ask you one question, perhaps for some bonus footage, I don't know. May I?
Please.
Very briefly, how has Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura inspired your own life and your devotional career? What does he mean to you? He wanted to reach out to people like you. He didn't meet people like you in his lifetime. He sent his books, he sent his people. And in a way, you are a fruit of his mission. So what does Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura mean to you? How do you see him and how has he impacted your life?
Okay, good question. I struggle, Abhi, with having been raised in a Jewish intellectual home where the cultivation of knowledge was considered the highest goal.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there was a part of me, perhaps the romantic, idealistic part of me that grew up in the 1960s, that was never really satisfied just with a reductionist, empiric, physicalist view of life and the universe. But there was never a connecting link between those two. Among many other things, I credit Bhaktivinoda Ṭhākura, and as you rightly said, his followers and grand disciples, including my spiritual master, Srila Prabhupada, with making that connection, with showing that an openness onto divinity as something alive and breathing and palpable and exciting and thoroughly personal is not at odds with a view of the universe through a scientific lens. That the universe is multidimensional enough to accommodate many kinds of truths. So you can both be a rationalist and a bhakta at the same time. I think for me, that was a very, very important gift from Bhaktivinoda.
That was so succinct and beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, it's always a pleasure spending time with you. I hope we get to do this
Absolutely.
again soon.
Hopefully, fingers crossed, inshallah.
Inshallah, yes, exactly. And to all of you who have been with us for this past hour or so, many thanks for your interest and attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in our next program.
Thank you. Thank you so much.